In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Welcome to the Missing Dots, where we ask the questions history was too afraid to archive. Tonight we open a chapter wrapped in reverence, controversy, and centuries of silence, Imam Shafi, the jurist hailed as a genius of Islamic law, yet accused by critics of shaping a sect that reshaped the Muslim world forever. Was he a unifier or the mind who unintentionally fractured Islam? Did he create a school of thought or a division? Why did millions adopt his madhab so quickly, and what freedoms or restrictions did it introduce? Did his methodology open the gates of ijtihad or quietly close them? And in a world of science, doubt, faith, and free thinking, what legacy has his school produced, scholars, scientists, or skeptics? Tonight we confront the questions whispered by Muslims, ex-Muslims, atheists, and historians alike, the questions no one dares to ask, but you and I will. So for everyone listening, I just want to set the stage here a bit, because tonight's deep dive into the source material relies on, honestly, a pretty massive, fascinating stack of historical sources.
Yeah, it's a lot to get through.
Right. I mean, we're looking at classical fatwas, deep academic research, and direct critiques from basically every angle. We've got rival schools of thought, ex-Muslim perspectives, secular historians.
Right, the whole spectrum.
Exactly. And our mission here, just so you know, is to really just look objectively at the facts. We aren't taking sides. We just want to unpack these really heavy accusations and, the scholarly defenses and just see what the actual historical record shows.
Yeah, just laying it all out on the table.
Exactly. So honestly, before we even get into the empires and the courts and all these massive theological controversies,
Yeah.
I think we have to look at the raw human story first.
Absolutely. The context is everything.
Right. Because, I never really thought about it that way. But we are talking about a man born in Gaza, right? In 150 AH, which is roughly, 767 CE?
Yeah, right around there.
And his start in life was, it was definitely not one of privilege or, access to power.
Oh, far from it. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi was orphaned at a very, very young age. His father died shortly after he was born. Wow.
Yeah. And to protect his lineage, to ensure he grew up with some sort of solid foundation, his mother, who was entirely destitute, by the way, she made this incredibly arduous journey to move them back to Mecca.
Back to the homeland of their ancestors, right, the Quraysh.
Right. Exactly, the Quraysh. But they lived in severe poverty there. The historical accounts tell us that his mother couldn't even afford to buy him paper for his lessons.
Wait, she couldn't afford paper?
No, paper was a luxury. So he would actually collect, discarded bones, flat stones, palm leaves, just to write down the verses of the Quran and the hadiths that he was studying.
That's a staggering image.
That really is.
Just, a kid sitting in Mecca, basically writing the foundations of what would eventually become global Islamic law on literal animal bones because he couldn't afford parchment.
SubhanAllah, yeah. It's a very humbling detail.
And the intellect on this kid was terrifying, honestly. Memorizing the entire Quran by age 7.
Right.
And then by age 10, he memorizes Imam Malik's Muwatta.
Which is no small feat. No. For anyone listening who knows the Muwatta, that isn't just a simple book of sayings. It's a highly complex, really dense legal manual of Medinan traditions.
Yeah, it's a heavy text.
And memorizing that at 10 years old is just wild. But here is the detail in his biography that I just find totally fascinating. He doesn't just stay in Mecca and become this localized scholar. He goes rogue.
He does, yeah.
He leaves the city
Yeah.
and spends 2 decades, 20 years, living out in the deep desert with the Hood-Hail tribe. Why would a legal prodigy abandon the academic center to go live with Bedouins?
Well, it's because of this really profound realization he had very early on. He realized that law is inextricably bound to language.
Okay, right.
You simply cannot interpret the divine will if you don't understand the exact parameters of the words used to reveal it. And the Hood-Hail tribe, they were legendary across the Arabian Peninsula.
Legendary for what exactly?
For being the absolute masters of the Arabic language. Because of their deep isolation in the desert, their dialect remained entirely uncontaminated.
Uncontaminated by what?
By Persian or Byzantine or Syriac loan words. These foreign words were already flooding into the cosmopolitan cities like Mecca and Damascus because of trade and, empire expansion.
So they were basically like a living, breathing time capsule of pure ancient Arabic.
Exactly. And al-Shafi, he didn't just want to be fluent, right? He wanted to internalize the absolute grammatical intent, the poetic structures, the deepest etymological roots of every single word.
Wow.
Yeah. SubhanAllah, he immersed himself so completely that he actually became a recognized authority on their poetry and their tribal histories.
Wait, a legal scholar became an authority on Bedouin poetry.
Yes. Because he understood that any misinterpretation of a legal injunction, whether in the Quran or the Sunnah, usually stems from a misunderstanding of linguistic nuance.
Like a misplaced preposition or something.
Exactly. A misplaced preposition, a misidentified pronoun, or even just failing to recognize when a word is being used literally versus metaphorically in classical Bedouin speech.
You know, the thing is, when you frame it that way, it's actually pretty simple.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. It's like spending 2 decades studying pure physics just so you can write a manual on engineering.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. If you are going to derive laws that dictate the daily lives of millions of people, from how they wash their faces to how they divide their estates, you really cannot afford to misunderstand a preposition.
No, you can't. The stakes are too high.
It is the ultimate legal defense.
Yeah.
But eventually, he does leave the desert, right?
It does, yeah.
So he's got this supercomputer linguistic brain now, and he enters the 2 great, highly polarized intellectual arenas of his time. So let's talk about the clash between Medina and Iraq, because this is where his mind really gets forged in the sources.
Right. And it was a massive geographical and ideological divide. So first, al-Shafi travels to Medina.
Okay.
And there he studies directly under Imam Malik. Now, Imam Malik is the towering figure of the traditionists, the al-Hadith.
Right, the Hadith folks.
Exactly. And Imam Malik's entire methodology was rooted in the amal, which is the living tradition and the customs of the people of Medina.
So just observing what the locals were doing.
Yeah, basically. The logic was straightforward. Medina is where the Prophet lived and died, so whatever the people of Medina are doing collectively right now must be what the Prophet taught them.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it was a very text-heavy, tradition-heavy approach.
Right. And so al-Shafi absorbs all of that. He basically masters the Medinan operating system.
Completely.
But then, due to some political turmoil, and I think there were some false accusations of treason in the sources.
Yes, there were. He was actually put in chains.
Right. He ends up in chains, taken to the Abbasid court in Raqqa, and eventually he settles in Baghdad in Iraq. And Iraq is a completely different universe from Medina, isn't it?
Oh, completely different. Baghdad and Kufa, they were the domain of the rationalists, the al-Ray.
Okay.
In Iraq, al-Shafi studies under Muhammad al-Shabani, who was the brilliant star student of Imam Abu Hanifa.
Right, the founder of the Hanafi school.
Exactly. And you really have to understand the environment of Iraq at the time. It was the heart of this rapidly expanding, incredibly diverse empire.
Cosmopolitan.
Highly cosmopolitan. It was dealing with complex agricultural economies, heavy Persian cultural influences, and all these unprecedented social problems that simply did not exist in the Prophet's time back in the Hijaz.
Oh, I see. So when a completely new legal dispute popped up in, say, the markets of Baghdad, they couldn't just look at what the locals in Medina were doing.
Yeah.
Because the problem literally didn't exist in Medina.
Precisely. They couldn't rely on Medinan custom. The Iraqi scholars had to rely much more heavily on legal reasoning.
Like logic.
Yeah, strict analogy and juristic opinion, which is called reiti, to solve these novel cases. They were highly systematic and very logical.
Okay, so now you have al-Shafi, this linguistic genius,
Okay.
and he has literally downloaded the 2 biggest, most opposing legal operating systems of the 8th century into his brain.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
He understands the profound textual loyalty of Medina, and he totally understands the brilliant analytical reasoning of Iraq.
Yes.
And he starts teaching in Baghdad. He gathers students. He establishes this massive body of legal rulings, which historians call his al-Mahab al-Qadim, right? The old school. He's this highly respected, established authority. But then he moves to Egypt. And honestly, this is the moment in the historical record that completely blew my mind.
It's an incredible moment.
I mean, I never thought about it this way, but think about modern academia or like modern politics today.
No, nobody ever retracts anything.
Exactly. Nobody retracts anything. Egos are way too fragile. People just double down on their errors. But al-Shafi gets to Egypt, and what actually happens?
Well, he encounters an entirely different reality.
Okay.
In Egypt, he is exposed to new chains of hadith transmission, specifically the traditions of the great Egyptian scholar Al-Layth ibn Sa'd.
Traditions he hadn't heard before.
Right. Traditions he had literally never heard in either Medina or Iraq. Furthermore, he's observing totally different social customs, a different climate, a different economy.
Right.
So confronted with this massive influx of new, authentic evidence, Al-Shafi'i does something that is virtually unprecedented in the history of intellectual thought.
He changes his mind.
He completely revises his legal opinions.
He didn't just, like, tweak a few things, right?
Yeah, no. He authored the Al-Mahab al-Jadid, the New School. He essentially retracted a massive portion of his previous life's work in Iraq.
Wow. I read that his Iraqi students were initially completely bewildered by that.
They were shocked. But he famously told them, and this is a quote, "If a sound hadith contradicts my view, throw my view against the wall."
Throw a view against the wall. That is just, it is the ultimate testament to intellectual humility.
Truly. For al-Shafi'i, the ego was irrelevant. The only thing that actually mattered was the dalil, the objective evidence.
Right.
His primary loyalty was always to the divine text and the prophetic tradition, not to the brand name of his own jurisprudence, you know?
Yeah, that's so rare. So, okay, we have established the profile of a man who is borderline obsessed with accuracy.
Very much so.
A guy who spent 20 years perfecting his Arabic just to avoid misinterpretation, and who would happily throw his own life's work in the garbage if he found a stronger piece of evidence.
Exactly.
But this forces us to confront the biggest, heaviest accusation leveled against him, and we need to look at the critiques from secular historians, from rival sects, and modern skeptics.
We do.
Did this man fracture the Ummah? Like, did his intense categorization and methodology take a unified, simple faith and just chop it up into competing sects?
It is a really persistent critique, you know. You often hear people, especially those who are looking at Islamic history from a distance, say, well, the Prophet brought one unified message, and now we have all these different schools of thought. So whoever started formalizing these schools is responsible for dividing the religion.
Right. That's exactly what the critics say.
But when we actually analyze the chronological history, the accusation that al-Shafi'i was the first to divide Islam, it completely collapses.
Yeah. Let's walk through that timeline, because the facts and the sources are undeniable.
Right. If we were talking about division, political and theological fractures occurred long before al-Shafi'i was even a thought in anyone's mind.
Give us the timeline.
Okay, so immediately upon the Prophet's passing in 632 CE, you had the Saqifa dispute regarding political succession.
Okay, so that's right at the beginning.
Yes. Then, between 656 and 661 CE, you have the devastating First Civil War, the Fitna, which permanently altered the political landscape. By 680 CE, the tragedy of Karbala occurs, which really crystallized the Sunni-Shia political and theological divide.
And even on a purely theological level, right? The early sects were already operating way before him.
Exactly. You had the Kharijites, who were excommunicating people and waging war over interpretations of sin.
Right.
You had the Mu'tazila, who were debating the createdness of the Quran and applying heavy Greek rationalism to theology. All of that is completely pre-Shafi'i.
And even within the realm of Orthodox jurisprudence, the other major schools existed before him too, right?
They did. Imam Abu Hanifa, the founder of the Hanafi school, passed away in 767 CE.
Which is the exact same year al-Shafi'i was born.
Exactly. Imam Malik was already the undisputed authority of Medina. So al-Shafi'i was actually the fourth major legal codifier to emerge. He did not create a division. He stepped into a world that was already incredibly diverse and heavily fractured.
You know, I think the real issue here is that modern critics, and even many Muslims today, they just conflate the terminology.
They do, constantly.
Because our sources make this massive bright line distinction between a firq and a madhab. And we really need to explain this to the listener, because if you don't understand this difference, the whole history of Islamic law just looks like a chaotic turf war.
It's a critical distinction. So a firq translates roughly to a theological sect. A firq represents a group that differs from the majority on the absolute core fundamental beliefs, the aqidah.
Like the bedrock theology.
Right. They might differ on the nature of God, the finality of prophethood, or the definition of who is and isn't a believer. A madhab, on the other hand, is entirely different.
Okay.
The word literally means a path taken or a methodology.
So the followers of the four Sunni schools,
Mm-hmm.
Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali, they are not different sects.
Not at all. They share the exact same aqidah. They are in total agreement on the foundations of the faith. Where they differ is strictly in the furu, the branches.
The branches, like the
application.
Yes, the day-to-day application of the law. Things like how to place your hands in prayer, how to calculate specific agricultural taxes, or the prerequisites for a valid marriage contract. It is a difference in legal methodology, not a difference in fundamental theology.
Okay, but that raises a very fair question from a skeptic. Like an ex-Muslim or a secular academic might push back here and say, okay, fine, it's not a theological sect. But if the Quran is clear and the sayings of the Prophet are recorded, why did we need his specific hyper-complex methodology at all?
Why couldn't everyone just read the source text and act accordingly?
Well, because treating a 7th century divine text and thousands of prophetic traditions as a simple, self-explanatory instruction manual is just historically and legally impossible.
Especially when you're running an empire, right?
Exactly, especially when you are managing a massive empire. By the late 8th century, Islamic jurisprudence was teetering on the edge of chaos.
How so?
Well, the judges in Iraq, relying heavily on racy personal opinion, were issuing rulings that looked completely foreign to the scholars in Medina. And the Medinans, relying on their local and their custom, were refusing to accept valid traditions that didn't align with their city's habits.
Wow.
You essentially had different regional supreme courts operating on entirely different source codes.
I mean, I can totally see how that becomes a nightmare. If a merchant travels from Medina to Baghdad, his entire legal reality changes.
Yes.
Contracts might be voided, marriage laws might differ wildly.
Exactly. Al-Shafi surveyed this landscape and recognized a profound danger. He saw that if the Iraqis leaned too far into human reasoning, the law would become subjective, basically a product of human desire.
Yeah.
But if the Medinans leaned too far into local custom, the universality of the divine text would be lost to regional tribalism.
Wow.
So he offered a book called Al-Risala, and this text is arguably his greatest contribution to human history.
Al-Risala. This is the birth of Usul al-Fiqh, right?
Yes, the principles of jurisprudence. It was a constitutional revolution. For the very first time in Islamic history, someone sat down and explicitly laid out the epistemology of law.
The actual theory of knowledge behind it.
Exactly. He didn't just ask, what is the rule? He asked, what are the rules for making rules? He defined what constitutes a valid proof. He categorized the Arabic language, identifying what commands are absolute, what commands are mere recommendations, and what verses abrogate other verses.
It's brilliant. The thing is, he didn't build a fence to keep people out. He built a foundation so the house wouldn't collapse.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
He standardized the grammar of Islamic law. I mean, think about it. Before Al-Risala, an Iraqi and a Medinan scholar arguing over a law were basically speaking two different languages.
Completely different languages, yeah.
Al-Shafi gave everyone a universal, standardized, legal framework. So even if they ultimately disagreed on a ruling, they were at least using the exact same rulebook to argue about it.
Exactly. He provided a methodology to manage disagreement without fracturing the faith. He unified the intellect of the Ummah by giving them a shared mechanism for legal reasoning.
Okay, so that establishes why the system was necessary. Now we need to look under the hood.
Let's do it.
Let's look at the mechanics of how this methodology actually operates in real time, because this is where the modern rubber meets the road, and honestly, this is where the critiques regarding rigidity really heat up in the sources.
Absolutely.
How exactly does the Shafi legal machine process a problem?
Well, Al-Shafi established a very strict, uncompromising 4-tiered hierarchy of evidence, and the jurist must proceed in this exact order.
Okay, lay them out for us.
Tier 1 is the Quran. If the answer is clearly there, you stop.
Simple enough.
Tier 2 is the authentic Sunnah, the recorded traditions of the Prophet. And Al-Shafi was a fierce defender of the Sunnah. He insisted that an authentic, solitary hadith, even if it wasn't widely known, must override local custom or human opinion.
Which directly targeted the Medinan reliance on local custom.
Yes, very directly. Then, Tier 3 is Ijma, which is the consensus of the scholars. If the entire scholarly community historically agreed on a ruling, that consensus is binding.
Okay, got it. And the fourth tier?
And finally, Tier 4, if all else fails, is Qiyas, which is strict, rigorous, analogical reasoning.
Okay, wait, let's pause on Qiyas and really break down the mechanics here, because I want the listener to really understand this. This isn't just like making a loose comparison, because two things feel similar, right?
No.
You can't just say, well, riding a camel is like driving a car, so the rules are the same. It requires an eel.
Correct. The ila is the effective underlying cause of a divine ruling. To make a valid Shafi'i qiyas, a jurist cannot use subjective logic. They must scientifically isolate the variable that triggered the original law and then prove that variable exists in the new situation.
Okay, let's walk through a classic example from the texts, the prohibition of wine.
A perfect example. The Quran explicitly prohibits khamr, which historically referred specifically to wine made from fermented grapes or dates.
Right.
Now, what happens centuries later when a new society encounters a completely different substance? Say, a fermented drink made from wheat, or in the modern era, synthetic narcotics.
The strict literalist might say, well, the text only says grape wine, so wheat beer or cocaine is fine.
Exactly, and that would be a disaster. So the
Yeah.
Shafi jurist uses qiyas. They analyze the original text prohibiting khamr and ask, what is the ilah?
What is the cause?
Right. What is the specific property of this liquid that caused the divine to ban it? Through textual analysis, they determine the ilah is intoxication, the impairment of the intellect.
Okay, so they isolate that variable.
Yes. Once that effective cause is isolated, the jurist can look at the new substance, whether it's wheat beer or synthetic drugs. Does it contain the ilah of intoxication? Yes. Therefore, the prohibition applies. It is a highly mathematical, tightly controlled logic.
It's essentially an if-then statement in computer programming.
Exactly like that.
But here's where he clashes hard with his old rivals in Iraq, the Hanafis, because the Hanafis utilized a tool called istisan,
Yes, Sissi-san.
which roughly translates to, like, juristic preference or equity. And honestly, from a modern secular standpoint, istisan sounds really appealing.
It does sound nice, yeah.
It basically allows a judge to say, look, I know this strict analogy dictates we rule this way, but doing so would create an incredibly harsh or unfair outcome for this specific community. So in the interest of public fairness, we're going to bypass the strict rule and apply equity.
Right.
Why on earth did al-Shafi hate that?
Because, to al-Shafi, istisan was a terrifying legal loophole. Yes. He famously wrote an entire polemic titled The Invalidation of Istisan. His argument was profound. Who defines what is fair? Who defines what is equitable?
Oh, I see.
If you allow a human judge to override a textually derived ruling simply because their personal conscience or their cultural background deems it harsh, you have elevated human desire above divine law.
You essentially open the door for judges to just invent laws based on the political climate.
Exactly. He argued that allowing istisan was essentially acting as a lawgiver alongside God. He demanded objective, textual anchoring for every single ruling.
So no matter what, it goes back to the text.
Yes, even if a strict analogy seemed burdensome, if it was mathematically derived from the text, it must be followed, because divine wisdom supersedes our limited human perception of fairness.
And that intense, unyielding dedication to the text results in some very prominent, very strict features in everyday practice.
It does.
Yeah, this is exactly what modern critics point to when they accuse the madhab of being overly rigid or disconnected from reality.
Yes, the everyday rulings.
Let's look at the famous ruling on wudu, ritual purity. According to the Shafi school, if a man intentionally or accidentally touches the skin of a woman who is not his immediate unmarriageable family, his ritual purity is broken.
Correct.
He has to go perform ablution all over again before he can pray. Now, an atheist critic or a modern secular listener looks at that and thinks, this is absurd.
Sure.
You brush hands with your wife while passing the salt at dinner, and suddenly your spiritual state is voided. It feels like arbitrary patriarchal control. It feels needlessly rigid.
I hear that a lot.
Walk us through the legal mechanics of this. Why is the school so unbending on this?
Okay, to understand this, we have to go right back to those 20 years al-Shafi spent with the Hutel tribe in the desert.
The language training.
Yes. This entire ruling hinges on the Arabic root word lamas, which appears in the Quranic verse discussing the invalidation of purity. The verse mentions, or if you have lamastim women.
Okay, so what does lamastim actually mean?
Well, the Hanafi scholars, leaning on their analytical approach, they interpreted lamastim metaphorically.
Okay.
They argued that in classical Arabic, this term was often a polite euphemism for sexual intimacy. Therefore, simple skin-to-skin contact doesn't break purity, only intimacy does.
Which, honestly, seems very practical and convenient for daily life.
It is practical, but al-Shafi rejects convenience in favor of absolute linguistic fidelity.
Right.
Based on his encyclopedic knowledge of ancient Bedouin poetry, he argued that the primary foundational meaning of the root lamasa is literal physical touch, skin meeting skin.
Not the metaphor.
Right. Metaphorical usage is secondary and requires contextual proof, which he argued was completely absent here. Therefore, the command must be taken literally.
So he is not trying to make life difficult. He is refusing to bend the grammar of the divine text just to make life easier.
Precisely. To al-Shafi, this isn't arbitrary rigidity, it is extreme ritual mindfulness.
Mindfulness, how so?
By enforcing this literal interpretation, the school demands that the practitioner maintain a constant, heightened awareness of their physical boundaries and their state of purity. You are always conscious of your readiness to stand before the divine. It transforms daily life into a continuous state of spiritual discipline.
Wow, that is a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah,
It's not a punishment. It's a required state of mindfulness.
exactly.
But hold on, let me push back with the exact opposite critique from the sources.
Okay, go ahead.
Because while some accuse the school of being too strict, historically, rival schools accuse the Shafis of introducing relaxations that look suspiciously like loopholes.
Ah, the Ruksa debate.
Yes, let's talk about riksa, divine concessions. The sources show that the Shafi school allows travelers to significantly shorten their prayers and even combine them, like praying noon and afternoon together if they're traveling a specific distance, roughly 81 kilometers, right?
Yes, around that distance.
They can also combine prayers during heavy soaking rain or due to severe illness. Now, a critic could easily say, wait a minute, you are obsessed with strict adherence to the text, but when the weather gets bad, suddenly you bend the rules of prayer.
Right, it looks like a contradiction. But the legal mechanism behind it is entirely consistent.
How?
Al-Shafi did not invent these relaxations using human logic or istihsan. He found them explicitly detailed in the authentic Sunnah.
So the texts say to do this?
Yes. There are documented hadiths where the Prophet himself shortened and combined prayers during travel and rain. To Al-Shafi, if the divine text provides a ruksa, a concession, it is an outright gift from God intended to alleviate hardship.
Okay, so rejecting it would be wrong.
Exactly. To refuse that gift out of a sense of self-imposed ascetic strictness is actually a form of arrogance. It implies you know better than the lawgiver. So, the strictness in matters like wudu protects the religion from human corruption, while the concessions in matters of travel ensure the religion doesn't break the practitioner. It is a perfectly calibrated system entirely bound by text, not human convenience.
Okay, so we have this incredibly dense, highly calibrated, grammatically uncompromising legal framework, which naturally leads us to ask, how in the world did this specific system become the dominant legal code for 500 million people today?
It is a great question.
Because if it's so rigorous, you would assume it would only appeal to a niche group of hardcore academics in the Middle East, right?
You would think so, yeah.
Yet, the demographics tell a shocking story. Let's look at the map.
The geography of the Shafi madhab is genuinely one of the most fascinating phenomena in Islamic history. Today, roughly 17 to 28% of all Sunni Muslims follow this school.
That is massive.
It is. That is anywhere from 350 to 500 million human beings.
And they aren't clustered in Egypt or Iraq, where the school was actually founded.
No, not at all.
The Shafi school dominates Indonesia, which has the largest Muslim population on Earth. It dominates Malaysia, Brunei, the Swahili coast of East Africa, parts of Yemen, and Kurdistan.
Yes. Historians often refer to it as the maritime madhab.
The maritime madhab.
Because its spread completely defies the typical historical narratives of imperial expansion.
Explain that.
Well, if you look at the Hanafi school, it became massively dominant, largely because it was the official state doctrine of the Ottoman Empire and later the Mughal Empire. It had the backing of massive armies and state bureaucracies.
Right, institutional power.
And the Maliki school spread across North Africa and Al-Andalus through the power of various dynasties.
But the Shafi school, there was no Shafi empire sailing across the Indian Ocean conquering Southeast Asia, was there?
None whatsoever. The spread of the Shafi madhab to the Indian Ocean rim was driven almost entirely by the Hadrami pipeline.
Who were the Hadramis?
These were Arab merchants originating from the Hadramaut Valley in Yemen. For centuries, these traders sailed the monsoons across the Indian Ocean. They were dealing in spices, silks, timber, and incense, establishing trade routes stretching from the ports of East Africa all the way to the Malay archipelago.
Now, I have to jump in here.
Sure.
Because if you talk to post-colonial scholars, or if you look at secular historical critiques, there's a very deeply ingrained assumption that Islam only spread through forced Arab colonialism.
Yes, you hear that narrative constantly.
The narrative is that these foreign legal systems were violently imposed on indigenous populations by the sword. Are you certain this was really just merchants trading spices?
The historical and archaeological records are unequivocal on this point.
They are.
Yes, the spread of Islam, and specifically the Shafi madhab in Southeast Asia and East Africa, was an overwhelmingly peaceful process that spanned over 3 centuries.
Wow.
There are 0 records of invading Arab armies forcing the Hindu or Buddhist kingdoms of Java or Sumatra to convert. It was an entirely organic socio-economic integration.
But why? I mean, why would an indigenous king in 13th century Southeast Asia voluntarily adopt a dense, text-heavy legal code written by a guy from Gaza who lived in Egypt centuries earlier? It seems so random.
It wasn't random. It was because of profound practicality.
Practicality.
Yes. As these coastal kingdoms in the Malay archipelago began plugging into the massive global trade network of the Indian Ocean, they encountered a major problem. They needed a highly sophisticated, internationally recognized legal framework to handle complex maritime contracts.
So like trade disputes and stuff.
Exactly.
Yep.
Trade disputes, international marriages. The local customary laws were often just too localized or informal to manage massive international commerce.
I see.
And the Hadrami merchants, they didn't just bring cargo, they brought their scholars with them. And the Shafi'i system, with its incredibly clear, systematic pedagogical texts, offered a ready-made, highly functional legal grammar. It was intellectually robust and very predictable.
And importantly, from what I read in the sources, it wasn't a cultural bulldozer.
No, it wasn't.
I was reading about how the Shafi scholars handled local customs, the urf, because a critic might assume that this strict literalist school would just annihilate indigenous culture.
On the contrary, while the core texts regarding worship and fundamental law were unbending, the Shafi jurists were remarkably adept at integrating local urf wherever those customs didn't directly violate Islamic texts.
Do you have an example?
A perfect example is the Minangkabau people of Sumatra in Indonesia.
Okay.
They are a deeply matrilineal society where property and land are passed down through the female line.
Which is very different from traditional Arab society.
Extremely different. But when they adopted the Shafi madhab, it created this fascinating legal synthesis. They maintained their Shafi strictness in prayer, fasting, and fundamental theology. But their indigenous courts worked to accommodate their matrilineal property customs within the broader ethical framework of the law.
So it wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a synthesis.
Exactly. It was a synthesis.
That is incredible.
Right.
But there's another layer to this adoption that frankly seems like a massive contradiction to me.
What's that?
And that is the Sufi connection.
Ah, yes.
I mean, how does a legally dry, mathematically structured, hypergrammatical system pair with the mystical, esoteric, poetry-driven world of Sufism?
Right.
Because the sources explicitly state that some of the most massive Sufi orders in the world, like the Baha'alawi in Yemen and Indonesia, the Qadiri, the Shadhili, are fundamentally tied to the Shafi madhab. It feels like mixing oil and water.
It seems contradictory to the modern mind, absolutely, because today we like to separate law from spirituality. But historically, they were deeply complementary.
How so?
Well, the Hadrami scholars who sailed to Indonesia were very often both strict Shafi'i jurists and devoted Sufi masters of the Baha'alawi order. Alhamdulillah, they recognized that a newly converting population needed both.
They needed the letter and the spirit.
Exactly. The Shafi madhab provides the indispensable physical architecture. It tells the new believer exactly how to wash, how to stand, how to fast, how to ensure their commerce is lawful. It gives them the structure of obedience.
Right.
Meanwhile, Sufism provides the interior landscape. It tells them why they pray, focusing on the purification of the heart, the eradication of ego, and the spiritual ascent toward the divine.
I love that.
The great scholars understood that you need the rigid banks of the river to direct the flowing water.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Without the strict banks of the madhab, the spirituality just desiccates into a murky swamp of heresy. And without the water of Sufism, the banks of the law are just dry, lifeless dirt.
The rigid banks and the flowing water. That is a brilliant synthesis. And it perfectly leads us into the intellectual controversies.
Yes, let's get into that.
Because while it provided a great structure for Indonesian kingdoms and Sufi mystics, critics argue that the sheer rigidity of those riverbanks eventually stifled the Muslim mind. Let's tackle the Ijtihad controversy. Did al-Shafi basically commit intellectual suicide for the Muslim world?
This is perhaps the most widespread myth regarding Islamic legal history.
The myth of the closed gates. Right.
Exactly. The accusation is that by writing al-Risala and locking everything into this strict textual hierarchy, al-Shafi caused the closing of the gates of Ijtihad.
Right, because secular historians and atheist critics often point to this supposed event and say, this is exactly when the Muslim world stopped inventing, stopped philosophizing, and started declining.
Yes.
They decided all the thinking had already been done by al-Shafi, so they just turned off their brains and started blindly copying old books.
It is a pervasive narrative, but the historical data vigorously debunks it. The so-called closing of the gates of Ijtihad, the era where independent legal reasoning supposedly ceased and gave way to taqlid or blind following, was a much later historical phenomenon.
When did it actually happen?
It began around the 10th and 11th centuries, long after al-Shafi's death. And it was driven by political realities, state bureaucracies, and the institutionalization of the madrasa system under various empires.
Oh, because the empires wanted to standardize law to control their populations.
Precisely. It was state control, not the legal theory of al-Shafi himself.
In fact, didn't al-Shafi explicitly despise blind following?
He abhorred it. He constantly urged his students to follow the evidence, not his person. He pioneered usul al-fiqh precisely to enable qualified scholars to perform ijtihad safely. He gave them the tools to think independently without falling into heresy.
Okay, if that's true, if this system was really meant to foster thought, then where is the proof? Who are the free thinkers? If this system didn't produce robots, let's look at the roster of minds it actually produced.
The intellectual output of the Shafi school is absolutely staggering.
Give us some names.
Well, you have al-Ghazali, arguably the most influential Muslim intellectual after the Prophet. He was a strict Shafi jurist who masterfully learned, analyzed, and then profoundly critiqued Greek philosophy in his work The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Okay.
You have Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, a towering theologian and philosopher who utilized his brilliant analytical mind to challenge the reigning scientific paradigm of Ptolemaic astronomy.
Wow.
You have al-Suyuti, a polymath who wrote over 500 books on everything from linguistics to medicine.
And the most fascinating one to me, honestly, is Ibn al-Nafis.
Yes, Ibn al-Nafis is a perfect example.
Because here's a guy who is a deeply orthodox Shafi scholar. And what does he do? He discovers pulmonary blood circulation in the human body a full 300 years before William Harvey discovered it in the West.
Exactly.
That blows the blind following narrative completely out of the water. But it does make me wonder, how does studying classical fiqh help a guy dissect the human circulatory system?
I would actually argue that the Shafi methodology actively trains the mind for exactly that kind of scientific inquiry. Think back to the mechanics of qiyas we discussed earlier.
Finding the ilah, the effective cause.
Exactly. To navigate Shafi law, a student's brain is rigorously trained in deductive logic. You are taught to look at a complex reality, strip away the irrelevant details, isolate the exact variable that causes a reaction, and then test that variable against new scenarios.
Which is?
That is literally the foundational logic of the scientific method.
Oh, wow. You observe, you isolate the causal mechanism, and you apply it.
Yes. It is no surprise whatsoever that a culture steeped in the relentless systematic logic of usul al-fiqh produced minds capable of mapping the human circulatory system or questioning the orbits of the planets.
That makes total sense. The legal grammar trains the scientific mind.
Right.
But we have to address the modern counter-argument here.
Okay.
Because I have seen modern critics, particularly online skeptics, throw out what we can call the Nobel Prize fallacy.
Right, the Nobel Prize argument.
They look at the Muslim world today, they note the lack of Nobel Prizes in the sciences compared to the West, and they blame classical Islamic jurisprudence. They say, look, the Shafi mindset clearly leads to intellectual stagnation in the modern world.
That argument is a profound historical anachronism.
How so?
It attempts to blame a 9th century legal grammar for 20th century geopolitical realities.
Right.
The Nobel Prize is a modern Western institution. And while there have been Muslim laureates, like the physicist Abdus Salam, who was raised in a Shafi majority context in Pakistan, before his community's specific theological shifts, attributing modern scientific deficits to classical fiqh, completely ignores the actual drivers of scientific output.
Drivers like money, infrastructure, and stability.
Exactly. It ignores centuries of devastating colonialism that extracted wealth and dismantled indigenous educational institutions. It ignores the post-colonial geopolitical trauma, dictatorships, and economic crises that have starved scientific research and development across the Muslim world.
Right, that's a huge factor.
The madhab is simply a methodology for interpreting divine law. It is not the cause of modern university funding deficits.
You cannot blame a grammar book if someone stops writing poetry because their house burned down.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
The legal system is intact. The geopolitical house is what caught fire. But this naturally brings us to the final and undoubtedly the heaviest part of our discussion.
Yes, the modern issues.
We have defended the school's historical intellectual rigor, but we must confront the uncomfortable taboos. we have to look at the hardest critiques raised in our sources regarding human rights, apostasy, and how a 9th century system survives the ethical demands of modernity.
These are the questions that dominate contemporary discourse, especially online, and they require an absolutely impartial, objective look based solely on the facts.
So let's ask the heavy question directly, speaking to the concerns of the ex-Muslim community and secular humanists. Are people leaving Islam today because of the harshness of classical fiqh? Specifically, what about the classical rulings on apostasy?
It's a critical question.
Because if you open a classical Shafi manual, the texts do mandate severe, often capital punishments for leaving the faith.
We must report exactly what the historical texts state. It is an undeniable empirical fact that classical Islamic jurisprudence across all 4 Sunni schools, including the Shafi madhab, contained harsh penal rulings regarding apostasy.
Okay, so that is historically accurate.
Yes. But the crucial historical context, which is absolutely vital for understanding why these laws existed, is that classical jurists did not view apostasy merely as a private crisis of conscience.
What did they view it as?
They tied apostasy inextricably to concepts of state treason, political rebellion, and social destabilization. In a pre-modern empire, religious identity and political citizenship were one and the same.
Oh, I see.
Defecting from the religion was viewed much like high treason was viewed in medieval Europe, a literal threat to the very fabric and survival of the state.
Right. It was political defection.
But here is the reality. We don't live in medieval empires anymore. We live in a world of nation-states, human rights charters, and internet forums, where people actually are having private, individualized crises of conscience. So is the Shafi madhab driving them away?
Well, if we look at the modern sociological data, the answer is largely no.
Okay. What does the data say?
The Pew Research Center has conducted extensive surveys in Shafi-dominant regions like Indonesia and Malaysia. The data shows that when people secularize or leave the faith, it is almost never driven by the intricacies of classical fiqh.
So they aren't reading the old manuals.
No, people in Jakarta are not renouncing their faith because they disagree with the Shafi ruling on whether touching a woman breaks wudu or because they read a classical manual on apostasy laws.
What is driving it then?
The drivers are largely socio-political. It is a reaction against modern political Islamism, exposure to internet-age philosophical doubts, rapid urbanization, and a general global shift towards secular materialism. Okay, so the classical madhab itself is not the primary driver. Global modernism is the driver.
So exactly.
And what about issues of women's rights and bodily autonomy? Critics point to Shafi rulings regarding female genital mutilation, FGM, which classically has been viewed not just as permissible, but as obligatory in the Shafi school.
Right. That is a major critique.
Or the strict requirement of the wali, the male guardian, for a woman to marry. How does a 9th century system deal with these massive modern critiques without basically breaking?
This brings us to one of the most dynamic movements in contemporary Islamic law, Neo-Shafiism.
Neo-Shafiism.
Yes. Modern scholarly institutions, such as Al-Azhar in Egypt or Dar al-Ifta in Malaysia, they are not throwing away the madhab. Instead, they are using al-Shafi's own highly rigorous methodology to address these modern crises.
Walk us through the legal mechanics of that. How do they overturn an obligatory ruling on FGM using the exact same system that created it?
It is a brilliant application of legal arithmetic. The classical Shafi ruling on FGM was based on certain hadiths that were historically deemed acceptable, coupled with a pre-modern medical understanding that believed the practice was either harmless or medically beneficial.
Okay, so it was based on the medical science of the time.
Right. However, modern Shafi scholars apply a foundational overarching principle of Islamic law, which was strongly endorsed by al-Shafi himself. La darar wa la dirar, do not cause harm and do not reciprocate harm.
The principle of preventing harm.
Exactly. When modern indisputable medical science proved conclusively that FGM causes severe, irreversible physical and psychological harm, the legal equation changed.
The variables changed.
Yes. The modern jurist looks at the texts used to justify FGM and notes that many are linguistically ambiguous or weak in transmission. They then weigh those ambiguous historical texts against the absolute, undeniable modern medical evidence of profound harm.
So the harm overrides it.
Yes. Applying the overarching rule of preventing harm, institutions like Al-Azhar have used the Shafi framework itself to rule strongly against the practice of FGM.
So the system is actually a living mechanism.
Yeah.
They aren't abandoning al-Shafi. They are using his internal logic, his exact grammatical rules and principles of evidence to arrive at rulings that protect human life in the 21st century.
Exactly.
It proves the methodology is robust enough to incorporate new medical realities without losing its textual anchor.
Precisely. It is a testament to the enduring genius of his architectural design.
It is genuinely wild to step back and look at this entire story.
It really is.
To think that one man's absolute obsession with linguistic perfection, a poor orphan sitting in the desert with the Hood-Hill tribe, painstakingly analyzing the root words of Bedouin poetry, just to make sure he understood the grammar of a divine command,
Yeah.
ended up creating a framework that shapes the daily lives, the marriages, the commerce, and the spiritual prayers of 500 million people across the globe today.
It is a profound legacy. He didn't build a prison of rigid rules. He built a highly sophisticated grammar for understanding the divine text. And, as we conclude, the sources leave us with a very powerful, provocative thought experiment regarding his legacy.
Oh, what is that?
Think about the defining moment of his life. When Imam Shafi moved to Egypt and was confronted with new, authentic evidence and a new social reality, he completely retracted his older rulings and wrote an entirely new school of thought.
Right, the throwing it against the wall.
Exactly. If al-Shafi were alive today, surrounded by the unprecedented complexities of modern economics, biomedical engineering, and global interconnectedness, he would likely be the first to critique modern scholars for being too stagnant.
Wow, really?
Yes, he would not tolerate blind imitation of his own 9th century rulings if new, stronger evidence demanded a shift. He would use his own rigorous methodology to forge solutions for the 21st century. His ultimate loyalty was always to the truth and the text, never to the past.
That is a staggering thought. A man defined by building a monumental tradition, who would likely be the first to radically update it based on new evidence.
Exactly.
And it leaves you, the listener, with something profound to think about in your own life. Look closely at the structures, the routines, the methodologies you rely on every single day, whether in your career, your personal beliefs, your relationships, or your habits. Do those structures trap you in blind imitation of the past? Or do they act as a solid foundation, freeing you to think more clearly, process new information, and adapt when undeniable evidence arrives? Are your systems a prison, or are they a foundation? May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.